And I would like to introduce our next speaker, Ian Grettenberger. He's the Assistant Cooperative Extension Specialist in the Department of Entomology and Nematology at UC Davis. And today he's going to be talking about Bagrada bug, a tricky invasive stink bug pest.
Okay, sound good?
It sounds great.
Awesome. Cool. So today I'll talk about Bagrada bug. So I cover field and vegetable crops, and this is a pest that I worked on a decent amount as a postdoc actually, and continuing to work on off and on. And hopefully talk about how this bug can kind of move and pillage across the landscape. It's an invasive pest, which I'll get to, but hopefully, even if you're not managing Bagrada bug, trying to worry about it, you can see how we kind of use an IPM approach to invasive species and respond to new pests. Okay, so this is the beast. So it's a stink bug, very colorful. It's actually on the smaller side for stink bugs, but many of you might have seen various stink bugs that show up in various crops. This is a stink bug, but like I said, it's kind of an interesting one in that it's smaller, it's very active, it's quick moving, it takes flight a lot quicker than a lot of the other big stink bugs. And just in terms of the identification, I'll show you some nymphs later, just passing through slides, but here we have the Bagrada bug on the left. There's a photo that's a harlequin lady beetle there, just for size. And then there is a harlequin bug on the right side, which is a somewhat closely related species in terms of how it feeds. But you can see it's much larger. So this is something that also occurs on mustard plants, but it's much, much larger. So kind of some lookalikes. So history of Bagrada bug. So it first made its appearance in 2008. And when it was detected in Los Angeles County in California, probably came in the ports. And then from there, it moved throughout the desert Southwest functionally, or the Southwest and Western US, and then also moved down into Mexico. So now it's kind of widespread across this region. And it's also made its way to Hawaii, showed up in South America as well. And its origins are actually in Middle East, Mediterranean area, Pakistan, etc. And so it's a cruciferous specialist. So it feeds on cruciferous crops, mustard crops. And so this includes leafy greens like arugula and cole crops like broccoli. And these crops are grown almost year round in Central and Northern California, with only several months off during the winter in a lot of areas, but obviously in warmer areas can be grown throughout the year. And as you can see there, there's some tattered damage on the foliage there, but the damage can actually be worse. And these pests are a real problem, or Bagrada bug is a real problem, especially for newly planted crops. So like this young broccoli field, and they're most at risk for yield loss. And when Bagrada bugs have moved in, they can cause severe issues. And they can also be a big issue for salad crops, whether or not the plants are small or large, because they're causing cosmetic damage. So that's kind of why we care about it. In addition, with some crops like cole crops, so we have broccoli on the left there, you can get this damage where they feed on the apical meristem, so the growing point, and you get, for instance, this multiple head formation on broccoli, which if you're trying to grow a nice large head does not work. And then on the right side, that plant is not going to produce a head at all. So it's functionally useless from a crop perspective. And I will acknowledge, if you don't grow cole crops or aren't worried about cole crops, or cruciferous crops, probably aren't worried about Bagrada bug for the most part. So I will acknowledge that they can cause damage to other crops. So here they're feeding on some peppers, tomato, and when it first swept through, almost 10 years ago at this point, then we did see there was substantial damage on some of these crops, just because they were feeding when they move through fields, but they really don't prefer it, and we don't really see that much damage on non-cruciferous crops at this point. And I do want to acknowledge at this point, this pest has been around obviously for a little bit. It's a relatively new pest, but the problem has been lessened, I guess, in the grand scheme of things. Then this problem has kind of shifted. So It used to be a much larger problem and a lot bigger concern in prime crop growing, well, coal crop growing, mustard crop growing regions, salad growing regions, like the desert Southwest, the Salinas area. But at this point, it's, I would say, a more localized, smaller scale issue, but it can be a really big issue for smaller farms when it does sweep through. And a lot of those farms also are managing organically. And so that can be a real big challenge to manage this pest, but it's not as big of an issue as it used to be, but we're still thinking about its management, and there's still folks actively working on long-term solutions, which I'll get to later. And so a lot of the work that I did and focused on was in the Salinas Valley. So here's kind of an overview. And when it first showed up, it was detected in crop fields. And when it first showed up, management was typically relied on foliar sprays of insecticides. And that was really the response, very quick, kind of the, we need a solution now. But then another key thing that we learned pretty quickly is that, you know, just like this kid here, Bagrada bug likes vegetables, right? It's a coal crop pest that feeds on mustard crops, but they eat more than crops. And so that's something that we looked at because they're in these crop fields, but then they're also in these neighboring non-crop areas. So they're out feeding on mustard weeds in these non-crop areas. And so this is where we want to start considering these populations out in rangeland, foothills, along roadsides. And so what we worked on was kind of this relationship between Bagrada bugs and non-crop hosts. And this is because they feed and reproduce on these hosts and build up their populations. And so this helps us better understand what's going to happen in crops and to mitigate the issue. So one thing we did, we looked at population dynamics, and this was focused on the Salinas Valley. So we did this survey across 2 years focused on Salinas Valley, so this area here. And this is the landscape I focused on, although this is broadly applies to all of California in terms of the general phenology, but obviously it shifts it a bit in terms of the Salinas area possibly being a bit cooler, although further down in the valley, kind of the southern end of the valley is pretty dry, so a little bit more comparable to see what we see in the kind of the Northern California region. And so we quickly learned when Bagrada bug showed up, there's some key non-crop hosts. So short pod mustard is one of them all over the place, as well as perennial pepperweed. It's more in roadsides and ditches. Very tricky weed to manage, but very important for Bagrada bug. So here's Bagrada bug feeding on short pod mustard, and here are a ton of nymphs feeding on short pod mustard leaf, and you can see the range in nymph sizes. So that's what they look like as nymphs, and you can get really crazy populations in some cases. So here are some aggregations of Bagrada bug on pepperweed. So we followed them in these non-crop areas over the course of 2 years, and I show just the populations on pepperweed and mustard here, and nymphs in red, adults in white. But basically you can see we have this pronounced peak kind of in the late summer where Bagrada bug populations build and build in the weeds, and then they tail off very quickly. And that tail off is when the weeds are drying down or dying from feeding, and that's when we were getting dispersal and movement into crops. So that would be the problem time. So that's really what we're focused on later, but we do see this little buildup early, and then again, movement late and later in the summer. One thing, what are the feeding preferences? Just briefly say, we were interested in feeding preferences between crops and weeds, as in, you know, are they preferring to feed on these weeds, or is it just because that's where they are? Super quick trial here, just some simple choice tests. But obviously we cared about broccoli as a crop, compared it to pepperweed and mustard. And this is basically just bug observations in this little choice test. And on the left, you see basically they had no preference between broccoli and pepperweed, about equivalent. And then on the right, you can see they were actually preferring short pod mustard. So they were actually preferring this weed, but clearly they were showing up in the crop at some point. And we really think that that's because of these dispersal dynamics and movement of the bugs from the weeds into the crops. And so an additional thing that we're interested in, it's not just about preference, right? And so these weeds have dynamics through the course of the summer. a lot of California doesn't get a lot of summer rain, and so that's what drives these dynamics with weed phenology. And so we're interested in kind of how these characteristics affect Bagrada bugs, because, you know, in early, well, I guess late winter, early spring, etc., you know, everything's germinating right now. Everything's greening up. Lots of these mustards are growing. We have all this growth. And then in late spring and into early summer, we have these mustard plants. These are pictures from the Salinas area for what that's worth. And then in late summer or mid to late summer, a lot of everything else has dried up, but short pod mustard is actually one of those weeds that just sticks around. Richard Smith in Monterey County, the weed science advisor there, likes to call it summer mustard, because I think that's a really good description, because it just hangs on during the summer. And it is one of those last weeds still surviving. And so these weeds are out there in the landscape, and that's what Bagrada bug are feeding on. However, at some point they do typically dry down, and that's when we think about this movement from non-crops into crops. And so weed phenology is really important for pest status. So this is Richard Smith here, and I just talked to him and had him rate host availability for these different weeds over the course of the summer. So 10 being super abundant, all the way down to 0 as in it's dry, gone. And this was for the Salinas area, but focused on some of the key hosts. So here we have wild radish. And as you can see, you know, in January, in December, starts to grow, it's available. January, February, it's very available, big green. And it starts to dry down in April, and it's functionally gone by July. So hopefully that makes sense, kind of the circle. So the closer to the center there means that it's not available. So had him rate a bunch of these different hosts. So wild radish in red, short pod mustard is in yellow there. That's the one I talked about. And pepperweed is in purple. So it's actually persisting later into the season, if that makes sense. And then, I'm sorry, just couldn't see over the thing. And so we have shepherd's purse too, in blue. So that one is drying up early, but it's another mustard. And so the key point that I want to show here is this is the time that we're interested in, because it's when the weeds are drying down, and that's when Bagrada bug is dispersing, and they're going somewhere, they're looking for food. And so that's when they're going into crops. And so regardless of the region, if you care about Bagrada bugs and their management, typically they're building up in these non-crop areas somewhere. And then as soon as those weeds are drying down and becoming less available, that's when the bugs are dispersing. And so obviously that depends on local conditions, et cetera. But that's really the critical part. And obviously it also depends on the weed species. In terms of pepperweed there, purple tends to hang on longer than some of the other weeds. And obviously short pod mustard also hangs on pretty long. But if those weeds aren't around, then if it's some of the black mustard, et cetera, those often dry down fairly quickly. So they're going to cause dispersal or not provide habitat as long into the summer. And so it might not overlap with plantings of mustard crops. So just some key takeaways. So just there are several primary hosts during this key period of dispersal. And these hosts do differ in effects on Bagrada bug in terms of their phenology and their ability to hold on to Bagrada bug populations or to support their population growth through time. And so through a lot of this work on non-crop hosts, really we're thinking about how this might be used to improve monitoring as well as management. So we're thinking about these non-crop areas surrounding fields. Obviously not all landscapes look like this, but there are non-crop areas somewhere. And so this is down the Salinas area. So there's, you know, roadsides, and then in this case, there's the whole river bottom as well, which isn't farmed. And so there's bugs there in the roadsides feeding on mustards, and then also in the valley. And so we're just thinking about how, you know, how those might be used for management or for scouting, because if you want to know what's going on with Bagrada bug in your area, going to those areas is a fantastic way to get a sense of your risk, basically, because they're dispersing, but they're not dispersing tens of miles. So it's a more local issue on that front. So I'm going to kind of segue into some general scouting and management thoughts. And this is clearly linked to the non-crop host use. And so, you know, because they're on these weeds, that's great for scouting. And one of the key things is actually looking for their damage. It's easier to find their damage than the bugs because there's more damage than bugs. And so here's a pepperweed leaf. And all that little white feeding, or those white scars, that's all Bagrada bug feeding. And it starts off light green right after they feed and then gets successively whiter. And eventually it'll kind of dry up and almost be like kind of scar tissue as the plants get pretty old. Here's what it looks like up close. If you look on the kind of the top right there, there's what we call starbursts. I don't know if you can see the cursor, but the very top right damage there, you can see the middle of that circle is where Bagrada bug stuck its mouth parts in, and then they move their mouth parts around and they feed in a lacerate and flush. So they're damaging plant cells and then sucking out the juices, but you get this fan shape. And so that's very distinctive of stink bug feeding. I will note, you got to remember you got to check to actually find the bugs, because just finding the damage that looks like Bagrada bug feeding doesn't mean that they're there, because Harlequin also feeds on these weeds and will cause similar looking damage. So I somewhat frequently check these weeds randomly around the landscape, just seeing if there's Bagrada bugs out there. And oftentimes if you find damage, get a little excited, but then if you just find Harlequin bug, it means, well, okay, it's a Harlequin bug population, not a Bagrada bug population. But they do co-occur. So sometimes you'll find both pests on the weeds. And so for management, a key thing is that young plants are most susceptible. So here's scarring on young plants, and it's very easy for them to feed on that terminal at this time point and either kill the whole plant or cause that weird growth, either no head for broccoli or cauliflower, or multiple heads at this stage. And so knowing that young plants are most susceptible means that that's the key time when need to worry about management. Because for cold crops like broccoli, there's a window. So until once they reach about the 5th or 6th leaf stage, they're not especially susceptible to severe damage, unless there's crazy populations, in which case they'll still cause a lot of leaf damage. But at that point, they kind of grow out of susceptibility because the meristem gets protected. And so knowing that young plants are most susceptible means that's when you need to keep an eye and really be actively managing Bagrada bug, if that's your goal. And so because I mentioned the seasonality and these key periods, there is the possibility to avoid damage. So you might be able to avoid damage by altering planting timing. And this is something that happened in the Salinas Valley because the populations were just so severe. People completely shifted their planting schedule or literally wouldn't grow mustard crops in an area knowing that that was a real hot spot for Bagrada, and they got burned in the past, whole fields almost lost, that they're not going to plant there. And so that's something that you can do possibly. Crop choice comes into play. So leafy versus heading. So leafy crops, like I mentioned, are much less susceptible to damage because the meristem is more protected. You get cosmetic damage, but they can grow out of that, or if that's less important for the market, in some cases, a little bit of damage might not be the end of the world. And then transplants. So another way to avoid damage is to get transplants, because then you're avoiding that early season period by simply jump starting the crop. So there's no longer a tiny little seedling that's susceptible if a transplant's there. Transplant's still susceptible, but it skips that first part. Obviously, it's small scales. Protection might be possible. So something like row cover. We'll acknowledge that this has to be done, I would say, well and early, because you don't want to trap Bagrada bug in there. They reproduce fairly quickly. This would be a nice warm environment. And so if you trap them in there, enough of them in there, that would be a problem. So it's really got to get it on early to protect it. But then like for broccoli on the right there, so you can protect them up until the point they no longer need to be protected, and then remove the row cover. So it can work out reasonably well. And this is obviously more of a small scale management. One thing that we did consider is trap crops. I will say we don't have, like, as far as I know, not really anyone has great data on trap crops for Bagrada bug. It's something that there's been a lot of talk about and questions. And here what we have is what we came up with for a study design, but it also shows how it might be used in a large field area. That these are mixed greens on the right, and then that is turnip broadcast seeded on the left. And so turnip gets up very quickly. And so you got a lot of leafy green tissue there planted at the same time. And that can be very competitive is what we think. And turnip's very attractive. And then you see it's on the edge as well. So it's intercepting, or ideally intercepting, Bagrada bug as they move into the field. And also planting arrangement might come into play in terms of ideally you'd have your trap crop and then some non-susceptible hosts, and the susceptible hosts even further into the field if you do have a mixed planting. But like I said, we don't have data for this. This trial didn't generate any data. And we'll acknowledge there might be some insectary plant issues as well for Bagrada bugs. This is something that was seen in the Salinas Valley where, traditionally, or for a bit of time, a lot of folks had used sweet alyssum as an insectary plant to bolster natural enemy populations. It's great. It provides food resources to natural enemies. And a lot of folks had these strips of alyssum in their field. However, it is a mustard. And so it's very attractive to Bagrada bug. And so there were definite concerns that, in some cases you might be making the problem worse with this insectary plant. And so it's just something to be aware of in terms of alyssum specifically being a mustard plant and can also be a host of Bagrada bug. But I mentioned trap crops, there's the possibility that it could serve as a trap crop. And we did some quick trials trying to see if we could use alyssum as a trap crop. The main challenge is it doesn't get up as quickly as turnip does. And so it's not as competitive in terms of plant biomass compared to the crop, and less attractive, which means it doesn't make an especially good trap crop in my mind. The final thing I want to talk about are natural enemies. So kind of one of those IPM approaches we always think about. So question is, can natural enemies influence Bagrada bug populations? And in general, with stink bugs, this is a brown marmorated stink bug. The general thought is they lay their eggs on leaves, right? Lay their eggs on plants, leaves, bark, etc. And in these little bunches, fairly consistent. It's kind of what we're used to as entomologists. And we'll say, right, because it's not the case with Bagrada bug. So Bagrada bug, again, kind of a funny little bug. And here's a diagram of its egg laying behavior. So it lays its eggs in the soil. This is an illustration from a paper. And here's what this process actually looks like. This is in the lab, but just focus on the female's abdomen there. So she is laying an egg, and there's a quick moment where you can probably see the egg being laid. Don't get distracted by the male. And before she covers it up. So there's the egg, and she quickly covers it up. So very interesting behavior, very odd for stink bugs, I will say. And so here's what it looks like. So there is a sticky glue on the outside. So on the left are some eggs that were laid in sand. They got laid, and then the sand immediately stuck to them. And then on the right are this is just what the eggs looks like a normal stink bug egg. And these were laid on just plastic substrate in our lab colony. But the thinking is they're probably doing this as a predator avoidance, and this is what they evolutionarily have done through time as a way to avoid predation of their eggs, or possibly parasitism as well. So they might not be getting egg parasitism as much. And so, Bagrada bugs are out in this landscape, like I said, and they're in these non-crop areas building up. And so we're thinking about these weeds and management by natural enemies in these areas. So on the left, there is a lacewing feeding on it. So we might have some generalist natural enemies, just things that, are predators. So things that eat the eggs, and then also parasitoids. So specifically focused on specialized parasitoids that attack eggs. And I'll acknowledge that I've helped out on some of these projects, but all of this work is largely read by these folks. So CDFA and USDA. So Brian Hogue on the left with USDA, and Charlie Pickett with CDFA. And then Chris has also started working on Bagrada bug as well. He's with CDFA as well. And so biological control, we think likely minimal control by generalist predators. And that's because its eggs are buried. And also we think that specialized natural enemies likely aren't really, or at least initially we didn't think that specialized natural enemies were really present. Oh, and then, so there are some candidates for agents for Bagrada bug that are being considered for release. So classical biocontrol program, these are from Pakistan. One of these has been found, Trisulcus down in Southern California. And then this Gryon is the one that's been focused on for possible release. And so Brian at his lab in USDA is doing lots of host specificity testing. So testing to see how specific is this biocontrol agent, because before it gets released down to landscape, we need to know what it would do to native stink bugs. So he's doing all sorts of tests for all of these native stink bugs to see, will it attack these species? And this shows his setup there in the lab. And then in addition, we did this survey of resident Bagrada bug natural enemies to see, are there parasitoids or predators out in the landscape eating the eggs? So we put a bunch of egg cards out, glued eggs to cards, stuck them out in the landscape. Here's what it looks like. And basically what we found, let's see if I can, is there are some natural enemies out there that will eat the eggs. So here are some ants as a time lapse, and you can see they're finding the eggs that are both uncovered by sand and also covered by sand. So some predators might find the eggs. We really think that that egg-laying behavior under the sand is largely protecting them. And we did find a couple parasitoids. There's a little wasp on the left, but we hardly found any when we were doing this survey. And that ended about, what was that, 2 years ago, I think. And so more recently, getting back to the parasitoids, so these are parasitoids that Brian is working with. And what's promising is this Gryon on the left, it's able to forage for the eggs in the sand. And so this is percent parasitism on the left for these different species. And that Gryon was able to find eggs that were buried by hand or laid under the surface. I will acknowledge the laid under the surface were naturally laid, and that number was probably a little low because this was also tested with ones that were laid on the surface, so they're probably parasitizing the ones more on the surface than under the surface. But basically, that one is able to find the eggs under the surface. So I'll just end with this point. So for Gryon, it was actually found in California now. So this was not a release. This was an adventive find. So somehow it ended up in the US, probably similar to the way Bagrada bug has ended up here. And it was found at one place in 2020 and then found at 8 sites in 5 counties in 2021. So it's clearly out there. And this was collected from eggs on the soil under the host plants. And again, this appears to have just shown up. And it also is co-evolved. So this was from its native range. And so now, the biocontrol folks are considering possible redistribution in California if possible. But hopefully this might serve as sort of a long-term management strategy for Bagrada bug. Right now it's not a major issue, like I said, in most areas, but still need a long-term management plan for these invasive pests. So that, I just want to acknowledge all the folks that had worked on Bagrada bug through time, started by my predecessor, Larry, various folks in the UC system, various cooperators, and then the folks that have done all the biocontrol work. So that, I can take any questions.
Thank you, Ian, for your presentation. So Michelle will jump in, and we have 2 minutes for questions.
Okay.
So the first question is, what is the extent of their range in California?
Yeah, so I think the northern reaches, most of the Sacramento Valley, and I know Cindy, you have found it recently in your area, or it was a more recent find. I think it's in most areas at this point. I think in California, I'm not sure if it's all the way up to far, far northern California. It's kind of but otherwise it's pretty much spread throughout California.
So I'd like to add quickly to that is that 2021, so this year, was the first time we have it documented in Sonoma, Lake, and Mendocino counties, which is why we were doing the presentation today. We do have a lot of row crops bedded up to vineyards, and mustards grow wild in the vineyards, can be a food source earlier in the season for Bagrada bug to to take handle into these counties. So it is here, and it has been found on multiple occasions this year alone. So it is something new that we're going to have to start to deal with up this way in the North Coast.
And definitely keep an eye out. I mean, when you see these weeds, like these mustard weeds, that's where it is. And I think it's kind of flies under the radar if people aren't growing mustard crops because it's just out in the weeds.
Do we have time for one more question? The next question is how beneficial are nematodes for soil control? And we got another question after that that you may answer in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, I can answer the second one in the chat. So beneficial nematodes, not really. I don't think there's any great data showing that. And I think, yeah, I mean, there's the possibility that that could manage the eggs if you had a special nematode that would attack the eggs because they are in the soil. But realistically, I don't think that's a great management option. Yeah.
Okay, so there was a couple questions that have continued into the Q&A. Ian, if you're able to answer, that would be great. We're going to move on to our next presentation.